So, another day, another tier list. YCS Bologna will be happening soon. So, what do we think the meta will be? Well, one really, really awesome thing I would say is that we're in a pretty diverse format. And so there's a huge amount of decks you can play. I think anyone from tier 1 to tier 2 has a chance of at least topping. There are a couple of decks that are a little bit of standouts, but yeah, it's going to be a great one. So Ignis obviously is not meta. Branded, I think, is like the epitome of a tier 2 deck. I think that we're in a hand trap format right now. And so Branded does struggle a bit, but it has a couple of unfair advantages that let it get around hand trap format. The first being Branded Lost. If they get to Branded Lost and you don't specifically have Ash, you don't even get to interrupt them because they just start chaining. You don't get the chance to imperm. And it's a bit like Infernoble with Near Space Connector, where a lot of the time you're forced to throw your hand trap at a Luba because if you don't, the same way with Infernoble, you probably won't get to use them anyway. So yeah, I think that's really good for Branded. It's also got Quem, which gives it alternate lines. Now, I think the biggest disadvantage Branded has is that there are a lot of decks like Rescu Ace and stuff that part of back row as well. Branded doesn't deal with those well. Having said that, it is a very good deck post side, can lock your opponent out completely, has access to some unfair win conditions, it's relatively consistent, so good deck. Yeah, I'd say top of tier 2, that's like the perfect example. I still think that Branded Synchro deck is trash. I think Nesh was just like tricking you guys, so yeah, putting that there. And then Branded Chimera is, I think, a good example of tier 1.5, but like at the bottom, I think it's a little bit better than Branded, but it's like bottom of tier 1.5. So what makes this deck good? Like, and historically, you guys know, I haven't thought this deck is that good, but I think right now it's ideal. Again, heavy hand trap format. It can play cards like Crossout Designator, which a lot of decks can't get away with playing Crossout Designator. This deck can because it has so much non-engine space. But then on top of that, it can just play a lot of good cards. It doesn't care about using hand traps to fuse with. You can start with your Branded line so Ash doesn't hurt you that much. I mean, just lots of little things that make this deck really, really good, I think, in the current format. I think the biggest weakness is, again, when you get into that top cut, when this is against a deck like Manium or Rescu Ace, a lot of the times it just gets battered by those dex engines because they do more. But don't discount this. I do think this is a good option. Dark World, I think, is like mid to low tier 2. I think the problem with Dark World is always going to be the same draw shifter. However, we've been seeing some really unique and interesting Dark World variants where they're doing things like playing Quacky Mario Guardian in the main deck. Playing 3 of those and then normal summoning it, and now you can't draw them. So it's like now they only really lose to shifter because they can play 3 Guardian called by instant fusion as well. Like, they have so many different cards that basically say no to hand traps. So it's an okay deck. I don't think it's as good enough to be in the meta. I think even a chance potentially it's high tier rogue, but it has potential. It's okay. Dragons. So Dragons is a weird one for me. It hasn't done much though, so I am going to leave it in tier 2 as well. I don't think it's a bad deck, but it hasn't done a huge amount. One of my mates did recently top with this at a regional, which is great. But until it does more, it's not fair enough in my opinion to put it higher than that. Drytron is like a mid to low tier rogue deck, I think. Unfortunately, it's just not going to change. It's like Dark World, but the only difference is you don't hand loop your opponent, which is just not as good. Exosisters. So I think Exosisters is a high tier rogue deck. Again, historically, I don't think this deck is that amazing, but I think one of the biggest problems with Exosisters essentially is the fact that there's just not that many ways to actually play the game. You've got your Martha, you've got your Aratama, and then that's about it. All of the Exosisters are very small and don't do much, and if you're against a deck that doesn't care about the grave, it's not great. The 4 banishes when they go first is good. The playing shifter is good. But in my opinion, if I wanted to play a shifter deck, it would 100% be Flunder. I think Flunder is a great deck, tier 1.5. I think Flunder has access to unfair win conditions very similar to Branded, but it has the advantage of dodging almost every card that people are playing to counter other decks. Draw is good against it, but Ash, a lot of the times you can't Ash them easily. Targeted hand traps don't work very well against them. Nibiru, you can nib them, but a lot of the time it doesn't matter. Things like Typhon aren't really relevant against them. I mean, it just has so many good ways to play around things. And then also, if you hand trap them sometimes, you get Featherstormed. They thrust set Featherstorm from the deck and they win. Or they just have Featherstorm anyway and they win. I think this deck has a lot of unfair win conditions in Shifter and Featherstorm, which will just give it... If you're in a big event, what's going to happen is you're going to play Flunder and maybe like out of 10 rounds, 4 of them you'll just auto win because you drop Shifter or you drop Featherstorm. Now, the annoying thing is another 4 you may lose because you just bricked and you drew 2 big birds and 2 traps or something. But I mean, that's how it is sometimes. I do think it's a good deck. Heroes, Rogue, Someone Rogue, hasn't done anything since that one guy topped of it. So Infernoble, I am going to bump that up to 1.5. I still don't think Infernoble's that good. However, I always say the same thing. For me, it's when a deck gets results, that's when I will put it up, and it has got results. Infernoble does have... I think that the 2 parts of Infernoble that are really, really unfair, and it's hard for people to deal with, is Near Space Connector. That card is crazy. Like, if it goes first and they normal summon Near Space Connector, it's almost like they can't lose, because even if they don't rip a hand trap, firstly, it means you probably didn't have a hand trap or you had nib, and so they can play around it. But secondly, even if they don't rip a hand trap, they have hand knowledge, so they can negate effectively. But then the second thing that makes this deck amazing is Angel Ring. Angel Ring is such a frustrating card, because before, at least, you could rely on opening Super Poly or Dark Ruler or Droplets. Now you can't even rely on opening that. Board breakers do not stop this deck, because most of the trap board breakers won't go through, because this deck is just going to negate them. Most of the spell board breakers won't go through, because Angelica's going to negate them. And so it's like, you need to open like double Dark Ruler plus combo, and and you won't kill them. Yeah, this deck is really, really good. My biggest problem with Infernoble is this. Firstly, it plays a lot of bricks, or it plays a lot of combo pieces, and so going second, it's not amazing. And secondly, it loses really hard to cards like Shifter and Droll sometimes, which is also a bit of a problem. But beyond that, I mean, we've been seeing quite a few people drop good results with this deck, so it's definitely got potential. Kashtira, I'm going to say, is probably somewhere in tier 2. I think Kashtira actually has a lot of potential, but it's getting the Dragon Link issue at the moment of not enough people playing it. We did see one Kashtira top recently, and there's been a lot of regional tops of Kashtira as well. I do think it's a good deck. I think it's a deck right now that can abuse things like Sphere Mode and Lava Golem, which are also great in the format. It can play Shifter, which is great in the format, but Kashtira does have a historical problem with bricking. But the engine is still good. Fenrir is still a good card, Unicorn is still a good card, and in the hand trap format, summon Fenrir and chuck hand traps at each other. The person with more Fenrirs will win, which will be the Kashtira player. So I do think it is a good deck. Next up we have Labyrinth, and I think Labyrinth for me is a high tier 1.5 deck. I'm not going to say it's tier 1. I think it's very, very, very good. However, it's not tier 1 just because I don't think it has the power to power through certain combo decks going first. Like, if a deck like Infernoble or Manium goes first, and you're second in Labyrinth and you didn't open Nib, you don't have much you can do, and you will just lose a lot of games like that. And especially in a format like now where you have other decks like Unchained that can just rattle you, I think Rescu is a good matchup if you know how to play the matchup. There are just a lot of matchups that you don't auto-win just by being a trap deck as Labyrinth, and I think that holds it back. I don't think it's a bad deck. I still think it's probably one of the best decks in the format, but for me, it's definitely going to be a tier 1.5. Next up, Manium. So Manium, for me, Manium is better than Infernoble. I think Manium, in fact, I even think it's better than Chimera as well, and I think it's better than Flunder as well. Manium is probably one of the most explosive decks in the game right now. The amount of time I've played against this deck, and it's like, you hand trap them or stop them twice. Like, you've made a board, you stop them twice, and then they just combo through your board and kill you. It is really, really crazy the way this deck can do it. And it can do it in a way that no other deck in the format can come close to at the moment. I think it's really crazy. They don't hard lose to Shifter, they do hard lose to Droll, but pretty much only Droll. And the thing about Manium as well, a lot of the times, is you Droll them, and one of two things happens. Either they talents you, and so you get punished, or they pass, but then if you can't kill them, they're going to kill you on the crackback, because they've still got the cards in their hand. Their deck is really, really recursive, really good. Yeah, very, very effective deck. I think it's probably the best combo deck we have at the moment, but yeah, definitely high tier 1.5. Wouldn't say it's tier 1 though at the moment. Marincess is going to be... The thing is, I'm always going to have respect for Marincess, because even though I don't think the deck is that good, it tops with ridiculous consistency. There's always at least one Marincess in top 64, top 32 of every event, for some weird reason. And so it has to be tier 2. Yeah, it's consistent. It's probably one of the most consistent decks in the game, because it's got like 14 starters, not including the consistency like cards like Signet Mining and stuff, which is crazy. But the problem with Marincess is always going to be killing you on the crackback. It doesn't do a lot. It's always going to put up a spell and trap negate, maybe a toad and a trap negate, and then it's like, that's not always going to be enough. But it's still a good deck. Math Mech is somewhere in Rogue. It's the worst Cyberse deck. Losing Circular hurt a lot. Pearly is... I'm going to say Pearly is tier 1, but it's a very tentative tier 1. It could arguably be tier 1.5, and I'll even say some of the tier 1.5 decks could arguably be put up as well. The thing about Pearly, and I do think it's a great deck, is that, fundamentally speaking, this is probably one of the most effective decks at getting to its game plan, because every single quick play does the same thing. It's that Italy from the deck, it's that Runic effect. However, there are so many silver bullets that destroy Pearly that hold it back. And in fact, for that, I'm actually going to move it down to tier 1.5, because I do think that's the case. The problem with a deck like Pearly for me is that what happens is your opponent's going to have XYZ on call. or your opponent's going to have D barrier, or your opponent's going to have retaliating C. There are so many cards that destroy Pearly hard that mean that a lot of your games 2 and 3s are going to be lost, not because you're bad, not because you misplayed, just because they had the silver bullet and they drew it and you didn't. And I think that does hold Pearly back. Whenever you're playing a deck like this, it's the same problem that Branded had with D barrier, and Sword Soul had with D barrier as well, where it's like a lot of games get taken out of your hands and there's not much you can do about it. And I do think that does hold it back. It's somewhere between tier 1 and tier 1.5. I could see an argument to put it tier 1, so I'll leave it here for now. Maybe if I see other decks there that don't belong there, I might move it down or something, but it is a very good deck. Rescu Ace, I do think is tier 1. I think, yeah, you know I love that deck. But honestly, I think the thing about Rescu Ace is, in terms of power level, most of the other decks here are better. But I think the thing that Rescu Ace does right now that no other deck really does is it's just a jack of all trades. Rescu Ace beats pretty much everything as long as they don't brick. And there's no real silver bullet that hurts Rescu Ace that doesn't hurt pretty much every other deck. Droll doesn't always stop them. Ash doesn't always stop them. There's no floodgate. You can make Arc Nemesis a Shatos or something if you want, but that's the only floodgate that kind of stops them. Lancia doesn't stop them if they open Emergency and Airlifter. There's so many different things the Rescu Ace deck can do, and especially in a really diverse format like this is where decks like Rescu Ace flourish. This is another deck where a deck like Sky Striker would have flourished before, because it's a diverse deck with loads of different points of interaction, with loads of different utility. That just makes it very hard to pin down, and as people are targeting different decks, none of those things do that much to Rescu Ace, so I do think it's a very, very good deck. I do think it's probably the best deck of the format right now. I can't think of another deck that is consistently as good as Rescu Ace in my opinion, so definitely tier 1. Rika, I don't know, somewhere at the bottom of tier 2, it tops a lot. It's the same, Rika's like Marincess, the only difference is people just don't read Rika cards for some reason. Runic, we haven't seen much good performance from Runic recently, so I am going to put it at the bottom of tier 2 as well. Yeah, it just hasn't done much. I don't think Runic is bad. I think it has potential, but yeah, I guess Lifetime Sprite, pure Runic, sorry, Sprite, Lifetime Runic and Sprite, same thing. You don't see much happening with those decks, which does hold them back. Synchron, I'm actually going to move down to Rogue, just because I haven't seen anything with Synchron in terms of good performance. I think all of the combo players are playing the more consistent combo decks up here. I remember when Revolution Synchron and Assault Synchron, all these cards came out, and we all thought, whoa, these power decks are going to be amazing. They've proceeded to do nothing. No one's even really exploring them with the new Diabell Star cards as well. So while I do think Synchron is good, and I think the Synchron cards are good, they are not performing. No one's really playing them, so they're going down to Rogue for me. Tier is, for me, tier 1 to tier 1. In fact, I'm going to put tier in tier 1 as well. I think tier is really good right now. I think, fundamentally speaking, one of the biggest things about tier is that this is a deck that a lot of the times what your opponent does not matter. This deck can just put up so many different interruptions, and not only that, but it can layer its interruptions as well. They'll have 2 to 3 interruptions as monsters, then they'll have 1 or 2 traps, then they might have a card in hand, then they might have shufflebacks from grave, then they have the field spell. Tier has so many ways of interacting, and it's just so hard to deal with this deck sometimes. One of the things that I find most frustrating as well is you play against Tier, you hand trap them twice and they full combo anyway, but then sometimes you play against Tier, you don't hand trap them and they pass on nothing. The deck is so hard to deal with. I personally really hate Tier. I think the deck should just go completely. I hate the shufflers, I hate the Ishizu cards, I think they're really unfair. But it's a very good deck. In my opinion, it is a tier 1 deck. I think out of all the tier 1 decks that you'll see, because I think there's only one other deck I'm going to put in tier 1, I would definitely say that tier is the most high kind of risk, high reward one. Where tier is the deck that when it goes off, it wins, but then about half the time it loses. But it's still a very, very good deck. And my last tier 1 deck is going to be Unchained. I think Unchained is... So, I think Unchained is by far the weakest of the tier 1 decks, definitely. I think it relies on 2-card combos, which is not amazing all the time. But the thing Unchained does have is it has this ability to kind of just play through anything. If you're I was watching Fabz video recently, and he was showing how the guy who played against Pac in a recent YCS played around different hand traps. And he was explaining how he could have even played around Imper and Veiler instead of getting stopped on a tour guide because of, like, I don't know, like Norm Summon Rhino doing combo, blah, blah, blah. And I think things like that with Unchained are possible, and they aren't really possible with that many other decks right now. You can kind of do it with Rescu Ace, you can kind of do it with Manium, but Unchained is probably the best deck at actually playing through hand traps, and I really like that. It can also play a lot of hand traps. And playing that DDD package is good as well. This is a deck as well that does play talents and thrust cards in it and does punish your opponent. So what happens a lot in other decks is you get hand trapped, you're still kind of stopped, but then you talents punish your opponent. Unchained, you get hand trapped, you're not stopped, and you talents punish your opponent. It's so good. So I do think Unchained is a really, really good deck in the format. I think it's definitely a tier 1. We're still in a flat format, as you guys can see, so I don't think any of these tier 1 decks are super above the tier 1.5 decks. I just think they're all pretty good. But yeah, there we go. Vanquish Soul for me is still tier 2. I don't think the deck is bad. I just think the engine, even with Xiaolong, is not that relevant. I think with Vanquish Soul, a lot of the times, you're very reliant on seeing your Raisin and winning your die roll and the hand traps that are good in your deck mattering. And if all of these stars don't align, then you just don't win. And so, I don't think Vanquish Soul is bad. But for me, it's a mid-tier 2 deck. It's not amazing. Virtual Order is only here because recently it did get a top, so I'm going to put it in Rogue. I don't think it's that amazing, though. And then let's talk about some newcomers to the list. So firstly, Fire King, and this is probably the one I know least about. However, from the little I've played of it, for me, Fire King is likely to be a low tier 2 or low Rogue deck. I could be very wrong, guys. Please don't get upset at me. But what you need to understand is, like, Fire King is a deck that, from what I can see, does what Unchained does, but a little bit worse, in that it puts up some pops. I haven't seen anything OP with it. I haven't seen people doing barrier statue locks with it, which is what I thought I would see. It's really just seems to be make that XYZ on your turn, whatever the rank 8 is called on your turn, and pop some cards, and that's pretty much all. They do have a hand trap negate and a hand trap monster negate, hand trap spell and trap negate as well. I guess those are cool. Other than that, the deck's not doing much. It might be as well because Populous needs to come out to help this deck, but yeah, definitely there. Centurion, I'm going to put in tier 1.5, and it's identical to Chimera in my opinion. It's the same thing, just doing it slightly different. This is a deck with a very myopic, one-card line, always works. They have loads of starters, however, it gets stopped by everything. And so your goal in Centurion a lot of times is just do your one-card combo, and then hand trap your opponent to death / lock them out of the game. That's your thing with Centurion. Now, what I've noticed a lot as well is that Centurion is a deck that, if you know how to counter it, is so easy to deal with. Cosmic Cyclone counters the back row so easily. If you have Drop Blurts, or if you have Book of Moon, not Book of Moon, Book of Eclipse. Actually, Book of Moon would work too. These work really well too. Like, all of these are very, very good cards. To be honest, even Dark Hole probably works. I don't know if they're protected by card effects or not, but if they're not, you can probably just Dark Hole the board as soon as your main phase starts. This is a deck that is easy to counter, but whenever you have a really consistent deck that is one card combos and a small engine, it always ends up in the meta just because you can just pull whatever techs are good against the meta and win. Right now as well, Centurion does have that kind of new deck smell where it's like people don't really know what it does, and so you will scoop a lot of wins because people just don't know how to play against it. They aren't prepared for it. So I do think it's tier 1.5. I think in terms of power level it will eventually drop down to tier 2, but for now tier 1.5. Mekanko I'm actually going to put as a mid to high tier 1.5 deck. The thing about Mekanko is the lock it does right now is something that very few decks are prepared for. It is hard to deal with an Acid Golem on your side of the board, even more so because most of the time the counters you have to Acid Golem are not that relevant because chances are they're going to rip it out of your hand. This is a deck that abuses Ken and Jen, great cards. The Mekanko cards are amazing cards. Ohime and Arabesque are two of the strongest cards that were printed this year. Like, if I was to do a tier list of cards printed this year, they would definitely be in the top 20. I think Arabesque potentially would be in the top 10. Like, that card, if you read it, is absolutely crazy. But we didn't really have a way to abuse them, and now we have Ken and Jen. I mean, you're just seeing the degenerate stuff done with this deck. I think we've barely scratched the surface as well. I think the deck has way more potential. But yeah, this is definitely a deck to worry about. I would argue, in fact, probably lower than Infernoble. Lower than Infernoble, higher than Flunder is probably what I'd say. It is a very good deck. Definitely one you're going to have to watch out for. If you don't have a way to deal with that Acid Golem lock, try and figure something out because you probably will play at least one person on this deck. I guess the biggest advantage is the deck is a little bit expensive. It's probably the most expensive deck to build in the format. But definitely a very, very good deck. And then Horus variants. They're like the bottom of tier 1.5. I think the Horus cards are good, but they're being overshadowed by the Bellstar engines right now. I think the other thing as well is Droll being in the format does hurt Horus a little bit. Droll and Ash, because what happens is you can get Drolled. The thing is, if you're a pure Horus deck, doesn't really work. And most decks, if they get Drolled on the out of the Pharaonic Sarcophagus, are not doing that much. The Horus engine is good. Pharaonic Sarcophagus is a crazy card. All the Horus cards are pretty good in terms of like their ability to give you free rank 8s. But we're not seeing a lot from it. So, in fact, I'm actually going to put it in mid to low tier 2 for most of the variants. I haven't seen any variants that are special. I think, apart from Horus tier, but that's more of a tier deck than a Horus deck. But yeah, guys, look, that is the tier list for now. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens at YCS Bologna. If I'm saying it wrong, please let me know in the chat. I don't know. But yeah, let me know what you guys think if you agree with this tier list. And if not, let me know too. We'll see what's happening. But thank you all for watching. I'll talk to you all soon. Peace.